I'll see him.
It's his napkin. I'm just throwing it away.
Bud sat there and ate his cake.
Oh, the cake is good.
Right?
So he's
Yeah. And you know, I guess that's why I don't know him.
But, you know,
but was it good?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's expensive and it's only November 7th.
Right.
and the last year.
It's right
So it's a little while yet.
Yes, it's a couple of weeks. Okay.
Anyone who has not signed cards, would you just sit down and get a pen and get after it? There's only 80 here, but we'll have more, no doubt.
It's true. It's true. Yeah.
We have more Federal River task force.
I know, we keep forgetting to tell them to,
Oh.
What are they for?
Yes. Yes.
People that have put their name down for the raffle.
Keep the on those, keep the envelope with the card. You have to put them down to fit the envelope.
Julia, those cards are so. I mean, it looks like something out of the store. It's incredible.
Well,
you ever thought working for Hallmark?
no, I don't want to work for Walmart. I had a friend that worked for Walmart. They didn't get, this was back in the 60s. They didn't get paid very much, and apparently they just cracked a whip over it.
Really?
Yeah.
I think it'll be neat. I think that will be a neat little surprise. Oh, they remembered me. Yeah, that'll be neat.
You know what?
I saw Katie was writing on a note and personalized.
Maybe when we go out there, we had told that man to come back for pumpkins, and we didn't, he wouldn't give us his name. Maybe we can find,
I think people respond to that. Good morning. How are you guys? Come on in. Come on. Are you here? Yes, I'm so glad you're here. Yeah, I'm Father Sam. It's nice to meet you. Savannah. Good to see you. Good to see you.
Glad you're here.
Yeah, come on in. Come on in.
Samantha.
Yeah. So, FYI, everybody, Savannah was one of our high school volunteers. Yeah, some of these faces probably look familiar to you. So Savannah was one of our high school volunteers. She helped out with our kiddos yesterday, and she also might be a backup for our nursery as well, which is super exciting. And Melissa is your name. Okay, excellent. And you guys, where do you guys live in Alito, right?
We do.
Okay, which part of Alito?
We live over by the middle school.
Okay.
It's in a,
Oh, that's right. Savannah was
Brook
telling me.
Hollow.
Right.
Yeah, we've lived there for about 2 years. I'm active duty military and we've moved around a lot.
Yeah. You and your husband is also active duty, is that right?
So
Or is he?
no, he was.
He was, okay.
He was Air Force Reserve, but he retired this year.
Gotcha.
And he works at Lockheed now.
Right.
So we really like it here in Texas, and we just made this our home before I retired.
Wonderful.
So thank you.
Are you Air Force also?
I'm Air Force, yeah.
We have my daughter's sister-in-law and her husband they're stationed in Clovis right now.
Oh, okay.
But Allie's is doing reserves
Okay.
because she has 2 little ones, and they would be deployed together since they were special ops.
Oh, wow.
So
Okay.
she started doing that, but she probably, if she could, she probably would love to talk to somebody else that kind of is going through the same thing and thinking about retirement and everything.
Yeah, definitely.
If I get a visitor's card, would you mind filling it out?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Julia is our faithful visitors connector.
Okay, perfect.
She hooks up all of our visitors with little cards. Well, let's go ahead and we'll go ahead and get rolling here with our study. We'll say a quick prayer and we'll get started. The Lord be with you.
And with us,
Spirit. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for bringing us together this morning. We ask that you would guide our discussion, bless our thoughts and our words. We ask that you would open our eyes to what you would have us hear this morning. Thank you for your love for us. Thank you for your presence with us. And we pray all this in Christ's name. Amen. All right. So just a quick little recap for our guests today. We are doing a study on the life of St. Francis of Assisi, who is our patron. Our church is called St. Francis. And so we're just doing a walkthrough of who that is, and just kind of a brief little overview. He was an Italian guy that lived about 900 years ago. A really remarkable figure. If you've ever seen people in their gardens often have like statues of St. Francis. I don't know if you've seen that before. So he's associated with animals frequently, but he was also more than just his love of animals and God's creatures. He was a real champion of the poor. He worked among the poorest of medieval society, and is really just kind of enigmatic guy. And we're looking at this book simply called St. Francis of Assisi, written by this guy named G.K. Chesterton, who is an English author at the beginning of the 20th century. And it's a really interesting book. It's challenging. Sometimes it can be a little dense, but it's good. So today we're looking at a chapter. We're looking at what chapter is it? 7, that's right. Chapter 7, the 3 orders. And we touched last week a little bit. I gave you a little bit of a preview on what that means, what is meant by the 3 orders, but we'll dive into it in a little bit more detail today. Before we actually look at this chapter, though, I want to share with you a little chapter from this other little book, and it's a story in the life of St. Francis that Chesterton's going to talk about in this chapter. And we've mentioned this book before. You guys have heard of this. Many of you have heard of this. This is The Little Flowers of St. Francis. Have you guys read this? Has anybody read some of these? You guys are familiar with a few of them maybe? They're pretty digestible little stories. And it's a pretty, it's a very old book. I forget when exactly it first was written. It was after St. Francis lived and died. But it is very, very old, and it's legends and stories of St. Francis and St. Clare. In this story that I want to read for you, we're going to have to kind of put on our Shakespeare hats a little bit, okay? It's
Juliet.
Yeah. Because
Shakespeare.
yes, because this is medieval, right? So this is not written like what you would ordinarily hear, but it's a really sweet story. It's a really interesting story that touches on the I don't know, non-romantic romance between St. Francis and St. Clare, which is something that Chesterton wants to talk about, because you hear this story of
A courtly
that's exactly right, a courtly kind of relationship that was platonic. You know, many modern historians might like to look back and try to maybe reconstruct, maybe there was a secret, love, romance, or whatever. But no, that kind of misses the point. The relationship that Francis and Clare of Assisi shared was this kind of spiritual friendship. And it was really friendship in the highest sense. And Chesterton will describe that friendship by way of mentioning this story, okay? So this story takes place after St. Clare has kind of joined up. Clare was a 17-year-old gal in the city of Assisi, and she wanted to be a part of what was going on with Francis in this growing movement of Franciscans. But at that point, there was not a female counterpart. There was not a female order. It was guys. It was just men. But Clare was adamant that she wanted to live this same life of simplicity and humility in imitation of Jesus. She wanted to follow Jesus like Francis did. So there's this kind of wild story about how she kind of escapes from her home. Her parents were not on board with this idea of her going and living a monastic life. They wanted her to probably get married and do all these things. They did not want her to take on vows of chastity and poverty. No, heck no. That was not what they had in mind for her. But she was adamant. Francis kind of helped her get out of there, and for a time, Francis hooked her up with this little Benedictine abbey, while he could kind of figure out, what do I do with a female follower, right? I can't have her bunking with all the guys. So he hooked her up with some Benedictines nearby and got things sorted out. And eventually, Clare would begin the Order of Poor Clares, the Franciscan female order.
Poor
Claire's?
Poor Claire's. That's right. That's what they're sometimes known as. So you always know a Franciscan if it's if they're wearing a brown habit with a rope tied around, or a rope girdle, and then their counterparts would be Franciscan nuns, who are of the order of St. Clare. But anyways, this story that I'm going to read takes place after St. Clare has kind of joined the fold, so to speak. Clare is not a new figure at this point. She's a good friend of Francis. And let me read this for you. This is chapter 14 of The Little Flowers, and this story is called How St. Clare Ate with St. Francis in St. Mary of the Angels. St. Mary of the Angels was the church. St. Francis, I'm going to read this is story time for us. St. Francis at Assisi sojourning would visit oft St. Clare, and unto her gave holy admonitions. Now she had a strong desire for once to eat with him, and to that end besought him many a time, but ne'er that solace would he grant to her. What's going on, St. Francis? Why wouldn't you eat with St. Clare? For which cause his companions, when they saw St. Clare's desire, unto St. Francis said, Father, we deem this sternness sorteth not with heavenly charity, that to Sister Clare, a maid so saintly and by God beloved, thou shouldst not hearken in a thing so slight as to eat bread with thee, and that the more, seeing that through thy preaching she renounced the riches and the splendor of the world. Yea, in good sooth, a greater grace than this. And she had asked thee, Wert thou bound to do unto thy spiritual plant? Thereat replied St. Francis, Think ye that I ought to grant it? His companions answered him, Yea, Father, meet and right it is that thou do her this solace. Then St. Francis said, Since so to you, so seems it then to me. And more to comfort her, I will this feast be in St. Mary of the Angels held, since at St. Damian's for so long a time she hath been cloistered, that 'twill gladden her to look a little on St. Mary's house, where she was shorn, and unto Jesu Christ espoused. There let us eat then in God's name together. And when the appointed day was come, St. Clare from out her convent issuing, with one companion, and accompanied by the companions of St. Francis, came thus to St. Mary of the Angels, where her salutation to Maid Mary given, before the shrine where she was shorn and veiled, to view the house they led her, till such hour as they should dine. So St. Clare was, she was set apart at the Church of St. Mary's. And so it was sort of a special thing that she got to go back to this place where she first took on her vows of chastity and poverty, etc. So St. Francis, therewithal on the bare ground the while, let spread the board, as was his wont. He put out the food on the ground, in other words. And when the hour was come, they set them down, St. Francis and St. Clare together, and with St. Clare's companion, one of the companions of St. Francis. Then who yet remained did range them at the board right humbly. And behold, at the first dish, St. Francis gan so sweetly speak of God in words so wondrous, that the overflow of grace divine descending from on high upon them, one and all were wrapped in God. It was this kind of, Francis was speaking about God, and they just had this sort of rapturous moment contemplating God. And while they were thus wrapped, with eyes and hands upraised to heaven, those of Assisi's town, the villagers, beheld St. Mary of the Angels, all the house and the wood near it. They saw the church and the woods nearby burning bright. And there appeared, as it were, a mighty fire, that did the church, the house, the forest fill, whereat the Assisians, the citizens of Assisi, gat them at great speed thither to quench it. They thought that the church was on fire. They saw a fire burning around the forest and the fire, so they got a bunch of buckets and they ran up to the church. We better put this out. There's a fire. But arrived at the house and finding there no fire, they entered in and saw St. Francis and St. Clare and all their company so sitting, wrapped in God, in contemplation round that humble board. Whence understood they of a truth that had not been earthly, but celestial fire, miraculously sent by God to show and symbolize the fire of divine love, whereby those holy brothers, holy nuns, were soul enkindled, and they went their way much comforted. A long time afterward, St. Francis and St. Clare and all the rest, returning to themselves and feeling sweet refreshment from that spiritual food, gave but scant heed unto the body's fare. And so St. Clare, this blessed refection, back to St. Damien with good escort hied, and seeing her, the sisters were right glad, for they had feared St. Francis sending her to rule some other convent, as ere now her holy sister Agnes had been sent to rule in Florence, or the sisterhood of Monticelli. So she comes back to her nuns, and they're glad to see her because they were afraid that St. Francis might have put her over some other convent, and they're like, oh, thank goodness, we love you so much. That would have been so sad if St. Francis had sent you somewhere else. So she comes back, and St. Francis had said to her, be ready if need were, I sent thee to some other house. And she of holy obedience, a daughter true, made answer, Father, send me where thou wilt, ready am I to go. And therefore now much joyed the sister is to receive her back, and therewithal St. Clare from that time forth remained much solaced. And this chapter ends with the words, to the praise of Christ. All the chapters end with some kind of benedictory sentence. Now, okay, I know that was a little bit of a slog, but it's an interesting story. It's an interesting story.
We may not have that for book club.
You maybe not. Maybe not. Yeah. It really is though. You could probably find translations that are like with updated language or whatever. But it's an interesting read when you go through these, and you really do have to kind of think about it. It'll expand your vocabulary for sure. But the stories themselves are really interesting. So like this story where St. Clare, she goes and eats with St. Francis, and they're having this discourse about God, and the townspeople look up at the church and they think that it's on fire, and no, it's just the fire of divine love that has consumed them. And whether that story be tale or true, it points us to a truth about the relationship between St. Clare and St. Francis. That it was this thing that was, in some sense, above. It was not an earthly kind of friendship or romance. It was this kind of heavenly thing, you know. To reduce it to some kind of, you know, rom-com style romance would do a disservice. It was not a romantic relationship. It was a friendship rooted in Jesus. So yeah, it's pretty interesting stuff.
It's on Kindle.
It is, yes. This is the little flowers. Yeah. I'm sure you could probably access the whole thing on, you know, Google. It's such an old book. It's probably in the public domain, or you could probably get it on Kindle for really cheap. So yeah. Check it out.
It's probably free.
Yeah. I bet so. Okay, so let's talk about this for a minute. This chapter 7, the three orders. Chesterton begins this chapter, and you might remember that where we are in the story is St. Francis has kind of been doing his thing outside of Assisi for a little while now, and he's gained a couple of followers. You know, there was a priest in a nearby town came to kind of join him. There was a well-known man in the town of Assisi that joined him. So there were three guys, and they weren't necessarily it wasn't necessarily a following so much. It was just three guys loving Jesus, doing their thing outside of the city. It wasn't necessarily a movement yet. But Chesterton says that as a fourth person joins, this man named Egidio, he says that, with the fourth man enters the shadow of a mob, right? Once there's 4 people, something's starting to happen, right? 3 people is 3 people, but when there's 4 people, it starts to kind of become a crowd a little bit. Clearly something is going on here. And so Chesterton says that when this 4th guy comes on board, it's like an invisible line was crossed. A movement is beginning here. And Chesterton, he wants us to understand what Francis conceived this thing to be. He wants us to try to wrap our heads around what Francis's intentions were with these men that had come to kind of follow his example of loving Jesus. And so he does this by describing for us what Francis did not think of them as. Francis did not necessarily think of his followers as monks, right? In fact, even today, when you think about Franciscans, they're not really described as monks very often. They're friars, and there's a difference between a friar and a monk. So what is that? What's going on here? Well, Chesterton says, and I actually alluded to this in my sermon last week, so Francis called his fellow guys, he called them the Friars Minor, which basically just means the little brothers. And Chesterton says that, presumably Francis was already resolved that these guys should take the 3 vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, which had always been the marks of a monk, right? So in that sense, they're similar to monks. They take on poverty, chastity, and obedience. And then here's one of the main differences that Chesterton points out. It would seem that Francis was not so much afraid of the idea of a monk as of the idea of an abbot. Okay, what is an abbot? An abbot is somebody who is the head over all of all the monks in a monastery. Francis was afraid that the great spiritual magistracies, which had given even to their holiest possessors at least a sort of impersonal and corporate pride, would import an element of pomposity that would spoil his extremely and almost extravagantly simple version of the life of reality. In other words, if you were to have people that were kind of like lords over the monks, if you were to have abbots, that would kind of spoil this simplicity, this humility. Remember, Francis was above almost everything else. Humility was just so important to him. And then another big difference between Francis and his boys and regular monks was that while monks would stay cloistered in a certain place, Franciscans were to be migratory. They were all over the place. They would hit the road to do the work of God. They were almost nomadic, Chesterton says. They were to mingle with the world, which is sort of an interesting difference here. Chesterton tells us about an interesting experience with the Bishop of Assisi that St. Francis had. And remember, the Bishop of Assisi was a good man. He had always been somewhat supportive of Francis, and he was a reasonable guy, but he always catered to this young man. But when the Bishop of Assisi heard about the strictness of the Franciscan rule, he was kind of taken aback by this whole thing. Like, really? Are you guys really not going to have any possessions? That doesn't sound very reasonable. That doesn't sound very possible, even. And St. Francis responds to this in his simple way. He says, well, if we had any possessions, we should need weapons and laws to defend them. And we certainly can't have weapons. So Francis kind of took on this strictness about poverty that he really would not let up on. Even later on, once he had thousands of Franciscans following him, Francis, as Chesterton says, Francis didn't really get mad about a whole lot. Francis was a very gentle man. But when we look at his life, some of the only times we see him really get angry is when his followers thought about relaxing this rule and saying, you know what, maybe we can own a few things. It's practical, right? We can't really be totally impoverished. So Francis was very stern about this. And his reasoning, that's a difficult thing for us to understand because, we live in a time that's maybe more like the medieval world than we might think. And to be totally possessionless was as ridiculous then as it is now, right? Who can really live without any possessions? Is that really possible? Who can follow Jesus in this extreme way? Is this something that anybody can actually do? But Francis insisted on it, and his reasoning was that if you have no possessions, you are truly free to do the work of Christ. You are freer than any man. Chesterton says the dedicated man might, as in the Franciscan, might go anywhere among any kind of men, even the worst kind of men, so long as there was nothing by which they could hold him. If he had any ties or needs like ordinary men, he would become like an ordinary man. Now, St. Francis had no ill will towards ordinary men. He loved ordinary men. He lived to serve ordinary men. Chesterton says that St. Francis was the last man in the world to think any the worse of ordinary men for being ordinary, right? This was something he was called to do. There were people that were called to do this, but they were out in the world serving ordinary people. So Francis is not in his high tower looking down at the ordinary person saying, how ridiculous of you for having possessions. That's not the case at all. Francis lived to serve the ordinary man, and he loved ordinary men. And really, Chesterton says the difference between a friar and an ordinary man was really that a friar was freer than an ordinary man. And we might say, well, are they really free? Aren't they kind of following Francis? Aren't they sort of subject to his rule? Well, yes, they were obedient, but not dependent. Okay? And Chesterton makes this point. They freely submitted themselves to the rule of St. Francis. And in that obedience, in that submission, the Franciscan was as free as the wind. He was almost wildly free in his relation to that world around him. The world around him was, as has been noted, a network of feudal and family and other forms of dependence. Okay? So the medieval world, like our own world, we live in dependencies. We're all dependent on one another. We have our families, our job. We have these networks of dependence. The whole idea of St. Francis was that the little brothers, the friars, should be like little fishes who could go freely in and out of that net of dependence. They were detached and able to do the work that God had called them to do in a way that really nobody else could, because they had no attachments. There was nothing that the world could hold them by, for the world catches us mostly by the fringes of our garments, the futile externals of our life. And then Chesterton will do his poetic thing here, and this is helpful for us to look at. And I love this. Chesterton says, it was the whole calculation, so to speak, of that innocent cunning that the world was to be outflanked and outwitted by St. Francis, and be embarrassed about what to do with him. You could not threaten to starve a man who was ever striving to fast, right? You could not ruin him and reduce him to beggary, for he was already a beggar. There was a very lukewarm satisfaction even in beating him with a stick, when he only indulged in little leaps and cries of joy, because indignity was his only dignity. You could not put his head in a halter, you couldn't put a noose around his neck without the risk of putting it in a halo. So there truly is no way to nail down a Franciscan. They are at ease in the world. Yeah, they don't know where their dinner's coming from, but they're truly at liberty to move throughout society in a way like nobody else can, and to preach the gospel like nobody else can, to live in imitation of Jesus in this kind of unprecedented way. Jesus himself had nowhere to lay his head, right? Jesus himself didn't know where his meals were going to come from all the time. These guys were doing their darndest to live in imitation of Jesus, no matter how strict a rule it was. Okay, so that's part of the equation so far. Any questions? Any responses to that so far? Okay, well let me ask you a question about our church. So, if a bunch of people were to start coming to St. Francis all of a sudden, it would be great. But what kind of problems would we run into? Like, I mean, if 100 people showed up to the 10:30 service, space. Don't have enough bathrooms, right? Our facilities can only cater to a certain number of people, right? That's the case with many movements, is that you're sort of bound by, your finances, your facilities, etc. But not so much with the Franciscan order that had no finances and no facilities. Chesterton says this: the old fraternities with their and so when he says the old fraternity, he's talking about monks, Benedictines, whatever. The old fraternities with their fixed habitations and enclosed existence had the limitations of ordinary householders. However simply they lived, there must be a certain number of cells, or a certain number of beds, or at least a certain cubic space for a certain number of brothers. Their numbers therefore depended on their land and building material. But since a man could become a Franciscan by merely promising to take his chance of eating berries in a lane, or begging a crust from a kitchen, or sleeping under a hedge, or sitting patiently on a doorstep, there was no economic reason why there should not be any number of such eccentric enthusiasts within any short period of time. There's no limits on this movement, right? And this is just, historically, I think this is an important thing to realize. How did the Franciscan order go? There were thousands of Franciscans before St. Francis died. Francis was not posthumously popular. He was popular in his own day, and somehow managed to maintain this kind of incredible humility. But how did that happen? Even forget about the religious aspect of it. How is this even possible? And I think a lot of it was the rule allowed for it. It was not bound by the conventions of most monastic movements. It had no walls. It was free to grow as big as it could. This rapid development, Chesterton says, was full of a certain kind of democratic optimism that really was part of the personal character of St. Francis. Francis had this kind of optimistic attitude about people in general. Now, certainly he had no question about the brokenness of humankind. Francis saw it firsthand. He lived among the poorest of the poor. Yes, he saw the brokenness of humanity. But he also understood the possibilities of what can happen when God's grace intervenes in our lives. And so Francis was very optimistic about, when he would go to beg food from people, he kind of expected that, people would be generous. And when people followed him, his rule was a hard rule, but he had a high view of his followers too. With God's grace, there's no telling what you can do. And so he counted on the hospitality of humanity, Chesterton says, because he really did regard every house as the house of a friend, right? Francis, people may not have, there were certainly people that didn't like St. Francis. There were people who thought he was a nut, people that maybe even hated him. But Francis, he had no such feelings as we can tell towards people. Even the house of his enemy was the house of a friend for him. Every creature under the sun was a brother or a sister. Speaking of that optimism towards other people, Chesterton turns at this point to talk about the third order of Franciscans. Okay, so if the first order of Franciscans is the guys, the men who followed Francis's example, and the second order There's the women who came along, St. Clare, and then those who followed her. So we've got the first, second order. Well, now Francis realizes the need for a third order. There are people like you and me who cannot abandon our families. I can't go and be a Franciscan. I'm married. I've got kids. I work here at the church. This is what God has called me to do. I can't go and be a Franciscan. Some people are called to that, legitimately. Still today, there are Franciscans, thousands of them throughout the world, following Jesus in a radical way. I'm not one of them, and none of you are either, from what I can tell. But again, St. Francis had no ill will towards ordinary people. God made ordinary people. Ordinary people are the best, right? Francis, he may not have, he may have been extremely harsh with himself. He may have been very strict in his own fasting. But I have a feeling that if St. Francis were here today, he would be making sure that each one of us had enough to eat today. He would be serving us. He would be ferrying cake back and forth from the table. Because again, Francis was not asking the whole world to do this. He wanted to serve the whole world. And those who would come and follow his example, great. Hop in. But not everybody's expected to do this. And thank the Lord, because I don't know if I have the energy to be a Franciscan. But some ordinary people want to follow Francis's example and teaching as much as they can, right? They see Francis and they say, oh my goodness, this man is following Jesus like I've never seen it before. And I want to do something like that. I can't go all the way like he does, but boy, do I want to get in on this fellowship, this friendship. And so the third order is formed as this kind of loose bond of people who are ordinary people. They're not monastics. They're married, they've got kids, they've got jobs, whatever. But they want to follow in this Franciscan way as much as they can. And so the third order is founded. Any questions about that? Any thoughts?
So was that a formal order that was made?
It
the
started
third order,
out.
or is that just a description of?
It started out informally, but now it is a formal, and I think it became formalized pretty early on. I think it kind of started as just sort of like a loose group of people, but now there are official groups of people that take on the name of Third Order Franciscans or Franciscan tertiaries, as they're sometimes called. And I know this is all very niche church stuff, so I'm sorry, guests. I know that
This is educational.
this is very very niche historical things, but it's interesting. I hope it's interesting. Okay, well
That's what I wanted to know before
yeah.
I got here, because I wasn't sure if y'all were a Catholic church, and then I was like, no, they're Anglican.
Yeah, Anglican,
I was excited
absolutely.
to just learn about it.
Yeah, for sure. So as Anglicans, we're not Roman Catholic, but we do celebrate our Catholic heritage, and I could really nerd out on you, I could really
No, my husband
go to
was
town.
Catholic, and
Yeah.
I actually started converting over to that for a while before we moved.
Yeah, well, and it's a pretty common story. I think people in this room can attest. That
You're surrounded by Catholics. We were Catholic.
Okay.
yeah, they grew up Roman. Yeah. And sometimes you'll often meet people that are like, oh well, I grew up Roman Catholic and my wife grew up Baptist or something. So we kind of met in the middle, quote unquote, in the Anglican Church. We celebrate the best of the Reformation, and we cling also to our Catholic heritage. We're sort of a unique breed in that way.
Gotcha.
And so we celebrate the lives of the saints. St. Francis was a Roman Catholic guy. He was, I think he was too humble to be anything. He was far too humble to leave the jurisdiction in which he was born. But yeah, we celebrate the lives of the saints, and something that I didn't grow up with. These guys know that I grew up in the Baptist world, and yeah. So you get it. So So growing up, we never talked about saints a whole lot. Never actually. And when I started going to an Anglican church, the lives of the saints really started to kind of feed me. It's like, oh my goodness, these people follow Jesus in such extreme ways, in ways that can really teach me. This is incredible. This is feeding my soul. And really, the whole tradition of the church really was like a treasure hunt for me. All this stuff, down to the bells and the incense and everything else. It really kind of opened my eyes to a lot. So, anyways, we're about out of time. We'll finish next week. We'll talk a little bit more about this chapter and about Francis's encounter with the Pope, which is an interesting story. Let's see. Do we have? Oh yeah.
So that would be good.
There, yeah. So there's Pope Innocent III giving Saint Francis his official endorsement, which is a pretty remarkable moment in church history. And we'll talk about that a little bit more.
Is that Claire on the at the
Yes,
altar
that's
on the
right. Yeah, that's Saint Clare. Absolutely. Yeah. Here's this is the Bishop of Assisi wrapping clothes around Saint Francis. That's when
You went naked.
when he went nude.
Without the hair shirt.
Right. Exactly. Here Saint Francis coming back from the military. Remember when Francis was going out to war, but then he had that dream where God said, "No, you need to go back to your hometown," which is kind of a hard thing to do. Everybody back home is probably going to call him a coward, but he knew he had to obey, so he went on home. I love this mural. I think it's so neat. I could spend a lot of time looking at it. Anyways, that's all I got for today, but thank you guys so much.
Thank you,
Thank
Father.
you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you guys for coming and sitting in.
Thank you for inviting
Absolutely,
us.
absolutely.
And what is your name?
Melissa.
Melissa, I'm Jane.
Now Savannah, I
nice
expect
to
you
meet
to
you.
read the whole book by next week.
Yeah.
Oh,
I'm so glad you
Yeah.
Yeah.